It is actually 4 o'clock on point. So seeing that we are still a lot of people, asking everyone to put back on their cameras if they want to. Yeah, I'd like to welcome you back to this next session at the EMU at the Crossroads workshop. And we're happy to move to our keynote lecture now, to kind of move in between the paper panels and get the discussion further. And I'm very happy to introduce our keynote speaker today, which is Lucia Quaglia from the University of Bologna. And there are a few people better equipped to further our discussion on the political economy of financial governance and EMU than is Lucia. And I'll just take a minute to briefly introduce her for those of you who have not encountered her work. And Lucia is, since 2017, I believe, a full professor at the Department of Social and Political Studies at University of Bologna. But before that, she held various positions at UK universities, a professor in York, and before that, also lectureship in Sussex. And she has also held visiting professorships or visiting scholarships at the EUI, at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies, where I think we met more than 10 years ago. So it's a pleasure to have you here. And Lucia has worked widely on EMU governance, and particularly financial service integration, the political economy of European Banking Union. And her latest work is, I believe, together with David Howard on failing forward in a European Monetary Union and financial governance, and that is where she will let us in on her thoughts today. A few notes on the logistics. We have about 30 minutes presentation by Lucia, before we then have about 30 minutes for discussion. For everyone here in on the workshop panel, you can just raise your hand after Lucia's lecture, and I will just take you. Then you can unmute yourself and ask your question by yourself. And for everyone in the broader audience, you are happy to use the Q&A function to pose your questions, and I read them to Lucia, and I'll pick them up and try to give some systemic order to that. So that's enough of prologue from my side. I would like to give the floor to Lucia, and very much looking forward to your talk. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to give this keynote lecture. Okay, so it's a paper is forthcoming indeed next week in a special issue of the Journal of European Public Policy. So that special issue is guest edited by Daniel Kellerman, Eric Jones, and Sophie Mounier. And the special issue explores the applicability of the failing forward approach to different policy areas, ranging from common foreign security policy to migration and so on. And David and I decided to look at the response of the European Union to the COVID-related economic crisis. And in particular, we focus on financial support mechanism. So basically, we set out, as I will explain later on, to apply the failing forward approach, or at least to use that as a starting point in order to shed light on the coming about, in particular, of the next generation EU program. I should also add a couple of caveats. If throughout my presentation I'm using the plural majestatis, that's not because I feel like the Queen, but that's because I just want to recognize that my talk is based on joint work with David, who is based at the University of Luxembourg. So just to set some background to our paper, the COVID pandemic started off as a health emergency and then became a full-blown economic crisis. It produced major drops in economic outputs, increasing unemployment, massive state intervention in the economy, raising levels of public debt and deficits. And in particular for the European Union and within the European Union, the Euro area, there were major concerns about the fiscal sustainability in southern European countries, and also the effects that the pandemic, and in particular the economic crisis related to the pandemic, would have on economic divergence in the Euro area and additional strains it would put on the single currency. So David and I, we identify our puzzle, and then we derive a research question we wanted to address. So the puzzle is that despite the unprecedented economic challenges posed by the COVID pandemic, and also despite major reforms or calls for reforms to economic and monetary union, including the establishment or the beefing up of financial support mechanism, the European Union / Eurozone has adopted only limited institutional and policy changes. So why is this the case? So just to give away the punchline at the beginning of my talk, so the overall argument we develop in the paper, and also that I will develop over the next 25 minutes or so, we argue that the financial support mechanisms that were adopted, in particular the Next Generation EU, and then within it the so-called recovery plan, are politically significant, are also symbolically important. They are also the result of a major diplomatic achievement, but we argue that they are macroeconomically not very significant. In particular, they fail to address underlying divergence, economic divergence in the Euro area, and also they don't provide sufficient support to member states in the Euro area periphery, which are already struggling with a high level of public debt and also a low level of economic growth, as well as raising unemployment. So just a little bit to qualify this argument, again, I would like to stress that we do recognize that it's an important political step. It was a diplomatic achievement, and that's symbolically very important for the European Union. But we also argue that it doesn't solve some of the underlying problems in economic and monetary union. I think I would also add, I think there is maybe no need, but I would also add that neither David nor I are particularly Eurosceptic. If anything, maybe our criticism comes from our sort of from our expectation or hope that the European Union would be able to do more in order to respond to the COVID-related economic crisis. So I think David and I, we would like to see ourselves as a sort of proto-federalism rather than sort of pseudo-Eurosceptics or somebody criticizing the European Union as such. So in terms of the theoretical framework, we use at least as a starting point for our analysis. It's more a theoretical approach. One analytical approach is the failing forward approach that was developed by Daniel Kahneman, Eric Jones, and Sophie Monnier. Why we use this approach? Well, for two reasons. The first one is a pragmatic reason, is that it was a special issue on the failing forward, or the applicability of the failing forward approach in different policy areas. But also, to be fair, we thought, okay, the failing forward is a useful starting point, because originally this approach was developed with reference to the European Union response to the sovereign debt crisis, and in particular the creation of banking union. So it made sense for us to use it to shed light on the development or the evolution of the European Union response to the COVID-related economic crisis. So for those of you who are not familiar with the failing forward approach, it brings together elements of the neo-functionist theory and elements of the intergovernmental theory. So it is articulated into 3 steps. The first step starts with the negative spillovers from previous incomplete integration. So these negative spillovers, they build up, they add on, and they trigger a crisis. The second step is the intergovernmental bargaining, whereby the member states, national government, they get together at the European Union level and they search for a feasible solution to the crisis or the problem at hand. So this stage is characterized by the traditional use of, if you want, of diplomatic power, of trade-offs, of side payments, so on. And then the third step is the reaching of an agreement, and the agreement that is reached by the member states to respond to the crisis is based on compromise solution. The original framework or the original version of this approach would characterize the outcome of the solutions which as lowest common denominator. David and I felt that this was a bit ungenerous, so we prefer to talk about incomplete solution or compromise solution, which are incomplete solutions that don't solve the underlying problems. They do stop the immediate playing out of the crisis, but they don't really address the underlying causes of the crisis. So we then use these 3 steps to structure our analysis. And we also take a long-term view in the sense that we start off very briefly with the creation of EMU and the negative spillovers resulting from it. Then we look how the European Union responded to the sovereign debt crisis, but then the bulk of the empirical analysis is of course on the next generation EU. But we felt that the other 2 steps, if you will, or the historical perspective was needed in order to sort of deal with the first step of the failing forward approach, which was the building up of negative spillover. So starting off with the establishment of EMU, so our argument is that, and it's quite well rehearsed in the literature, so in this sense, we are not really saying anything new, is that EMU was created in an incomplete way, in an asymmetric way. It was a full monetary union without an economic union, and in particular without Fiscal Union. There were weak fiscal rules that were agreed, in particular Stability and Growth Pact, and also as originally established, there were a non-existing financial support mechanism for countries experiencing financial problems in the euro area. So these mechanisms were only created in response to the sovereign debt crisis. So these negative spillovers, they sort of built up and they contributed to the sovereign debt crisis. So the response of the European Union / Eurozone to the sovereign debt crisis was based on negotiation amongst the member states, the reach and the quest for a compromise, and the agreement on sort of incomplete solutions that did manage to stop the crisis, but they didn't address the underlying causes of the crisis. So in this case, the main solutions or measures were adopted to deal with the sovereign debt crisis were fiscal rules, which were marginally enforced, the creation first of the temporary European Financial Stability Facility, and then the permanent European Stability Mechanism, a heavy reliance on the non-conventional monetary policy of the ECB, and also for completeness of information. I think we should also add the establishment of banking union, in particular the establishment of the single supervisory mechanism, of the single resolution mechanism, but we don't include them in our slide and also in our analysis, because in this paper we are really mainly looking at financial support mechanism. So these were solutions that were agreed by the European Union, its member states, to respond to the previous crisis, to the sovereign debt crisis. But these were actually didn't solve the underlying problem, and therefore they generated negative spillovers that built up and then played out in the COVID-related economic crisis. So just, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with some basic data. What we wanted to stress, and that's the table we also included in the paper, is that in economic monetary union, there's been an increase in divergence of the national economies of the member states. So here I simply report data for the 5 largest member states, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands. And these are data about GDP per capita, unemployment rate, and government debt level. And what, in a way, we wanted to show, the reason why we include the table in the paper and also in this presentation, is simply to show that even prior to the COVID-related economic crisis, there were different economic performance across the member states, and there was an increasing divergence between, if you want, the best performer member states and member states which were mostly in the Southern European periphery. Now we move on then to the COVID-related economic crisis. So the first observation is that, of course, the COVID-related economic crisis did not result from the asymmetries of EMU or the incompleteness of EMU. It was, we started off as a health emergency and then became a full-blown economic crisis in the European Union, the member states, and also worldwide. What we argue, though, is that the negative spillovers from incomplete integration in economic and monetary union, the asymmetric policy framework for EMU, actually affected the way in which the crisis played out in different Eurozone member states, in particular the way in which affected more the economies of some member states. So the argument is that there were structural vulnerabilities that were baked into the EMU framework, and when the economic crisis related to COVID came about, this produced further divergence in the member states. So the European Union then needed to elaborate a response to the COVID-related economic crisis. And that's where, if you want, the second step of the failing forward approach comes in. So member states in particular, at least in the first stage of the negotiation, they were in a driving seat. So it was a matter of trying to reconcile different national preferences. There were 2 main coalitions that had different preferences. There was a coalition that was mainly led by Italy. It included Spain, Portugal, and Greece. And these countries sought financial support mechanism. In particular, they sought the use of European Union grants and also called for Eurobonds, to be more precise, the creation of Corona bonds. Then there was the, if you want, the opposite side, which was led by the Netherlands. This coalition is often referred as the Frugal Four. And these countries opposed the idea of creating the Corona bonds and called for the use of existing financial support mechanism, in particular the European Stability Mechanism, first initially with conditionality attached, and then over time as the situation evolved without conditionality. France and the European Commission were in between, if you want, the position of the 2 coalitions. And last but not the least, there was the position of policy preferences of Germany, which in a way shifted position. It was quite a remarkable shift as compared to the positions or preferences generally upheld by German policymakers whenever it's time to discuss EMU reforms, and also, for example, when it was time to discuss the response of the European Union to the sovereign debt crisis. So this shift meant that the position of German policymakers moved closer to the preferences and solutions proposed by France and later on the Commission. And in particular, there was the formation of a Franco-German axis, which played a major role in putting forward a proposal for the next generation EU and also sort of seeing it to conclusion, so to speak. So this coalition, they negotiated. There was a first set of measures that were adopted. These were compromise solutions, which were acceptable to all the member states, or at least the sort of the two main coalitions. And these measures were adopted in April 2020. They were or included the suspension of the fiscal rules and the Stability and Growth Pact. They also included the suspension of EU rules on state aid, increased use of the European Union budget, increased firepower of the European Stability Mechanism, and the creation of the so-called pandemic credit line, I think it's called in this way, which doesn't have a conditionality, or at least doesn't have a really binding conditionality or binding conditionality attached to it. The establishment of the SURE program, which provides loans to member states, in particular to fund the unemployment schemes in the member states. And then there were guarantees that were issued by the European investment banks for loans to small and medium enterprises. Now, these measures amounted to about 540 billion euros, 3% of the European Union GDP approximately. But, and it's an important but for our argument, is that these were all loans, they were not grants. So after the adoption of this sort of first set of measures, there was a need to come up with a more decisive response of the European Union to the crisis. So the negotiation started on the Franco-German proposal to create what then became called the Next Generation EU funding program, and then within it, the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So in this case, I'm skipping through this part quickly. There was the intergovernmental level of the negotiations, the need to find a compromise that was acceptable to all the main players, and this is what was eventually agreed. So according to several policymakers, particular policymakers in European Union institutions, but also national policymakers in all the member states, so Southern European and Northern European policymakers and core countries policymakers, the Next Generation EU is generally presented as a major step in European integration, an unprecedented development, a radical set of measures. And David and I wanted to ask, is this really the case? And then we were left with the major problem of how to evaluate the Next Generation EU, in particular, whether it was an adequate response of the European Union to the crisis or not. So in a sense, the question for us was, how long is a piece of string? Which criteria could we come up or identify in order to guide our assessment? So we came up with these 4 criteria. I think the third one are perhaps the most important. The first one was criteria about size. Is the Next Generation EU big enough in terms of economic firepower? Second criteria, is it timely enough? So it has to do with timing. The third one is what is the long-term impacts of the program of the Next Generation EU. And then the fourth one, does it set a powerful new precedent? So we then applied these criteria to sort of the empirics, in particular to the main features of the Next Generation EU. So first question, size, is it big enough? The answer is a partial no, in the sense that some member state economies shrank by more than 10% during the pandemic, and the grant part of the recovery fund amounts to about 390 billion euros, and that's approximately 2.2% of the European Union GDP over 3 years. We also looked at, how the funding is going to be, if you want, allocated or distributed, and we noted that the countries that were hit the most by the first wave of the pandemic, but also by the second one, didn't get the most money. So Spain got a grant of 3% of GDP and Italy 2%. So we recognize that this is helpful. Maybe we also recognize that politically it was perhaps the most that could be achieved. However, the point we are trying to make is that it is not macroeconomically significant. Second criteria, is it timely? Here the answer is no, because the disbursement will not reach countries before mid, if not the end of 2021. Whereas in order to deal with the massive economic damage caused by lockdowns and the pandemic, member states would have needed money from March 2020 onwards. Third criteria, what is likely to be the long-term impact of the Next Generation EU? It doesn't involve a permanent increase in the European Union budget. It doesn't give the Commission the ability to raise its own funds. It retains an important role of the Council and voting through qualified majority voting, but also there is the provision about member state breaks. And in the absence of future political agreement on new sources of EU funding, in particular new European Union taxes, which are politically tricky, debt repayments will have to come from the European Union budget. Final point, does it set a powerful precedent? And I think maybe on this point, maybe also on other points, but we have been a bit too tranchant, so to speak. But our argument is that it's not a Hamiltonian moment. It doesn't create a fiscal union or a transfer union. And first of all, there is little new in the sense the Commission already had the ability to issue bonds. The cohesion and structural funds already entail indirect transfer between the member states. And there are already existing financial support mechanisms which borrow on the market in order to provide loans to ailing countries. Though we do recognize these were mechanisms that only provided loans, whereas the Next Generation EU has a grant component in it. Okay, so just a sort of one chart I'm sure you're quite familiar with, but we use that to substantiate or sort of to hammer our point. And this is a chart that looks at the evolution of the public debt to GDP ratio in the three largest member states, and also that include actually 4 largest member states, and then also looks at the data for the lowest or the best performers member states as far as the public debt is concerned. So in this case, the worst performer indeed is the black line. It's Italy that has a public debt of public debt to GDP ratio of about 160% by the end of 2021, whereas the best performer, at least amongst the 4 largest countries, is Germany, which has a public debt to GDP ratio that is about half of the public debt to GDP ratio in Italy. And if we look at the best performers, quote unquote, in the euro area, then debt to GDP ratio is in the range of 40%. So in a sense, we use this as a sort of list, as an image of the increasing divergence in the euro area and the problems that are not really solved by the next generation EU, which yes has a grant component, but also has a loan component, which would add, maybe not in the official statistics, but de facto would add to the high level of public debt in the euro area periphery. So just to conclude, because it's 4:30, so I'm pleased that I timed my presentation properly. We argue that the response of the European Union to the COVID-related economic crisis, and in particular the creation or the beefing up of large financial support mechanism, was delayed and also was watered down by intergovernmental negotiations. The outcomes, so the solutions that were proposed, the measures adopted to deal with the crisis. So the first set of measures in April 2020, and then the next generation EU, were the result of compromises between the different preferences, positions of the member states. Overall, they were closer to the preference of or preferences of Germany, which, like in previous crises, had a constrained veto power. That's an expression that is coined by Simon Balmer and also Willie Patterson. So that means that German policymaker Germany has a veto power, but the veto power in deciding the major EMU reform is constrained by the need to ensure the survival of the euro and the viability of economic and monetary union. And the solutions that were adopted at the European Union level are sticking plaster solution. Now, because we use this word in the paper, and David and I, we also had a bit of a debate, because one of us felt that maybe it was a bit ungenerous. But what we mean by stick and plaster solution means that these are solutions, measures that stop the crisis, but they don't stop the bleeding, if you carry on with the stick and plaster metaphor, but they don't address the underlying pathologies, the underlying causes of the crisis, and therefore they are unlikely to stave off another sovereign debt crisis due to rising level of public debt. So to conclude, we think that the European Union, and in particular the euro area, it keeps on failing forward. So it goes forward because it manages to survive crises, but then the incomplete solutions that were adopted, they lay the foundation for further crisis, or at least they don't prevent further crisis. And I think I shall stop here, and I will also interrupt my screen sharing.
Thank you very much, Lucia, for that very interesting presentation. Also a lot of food for discussion, I believe. There are a number of questions and comments already in the chat. And since we cannot all manage to have that at the same time, and also the audience cannot see the chat, I will just take up different hands. So I see already Jonathan had posted a question in the chat, but also raised his hand and here on the first. So Jonathan, I give you the word first.
Thank you very much. So thanks for the presentation and the paper, Lucia. I mean, the question that I posed in the chat has to do with another aspect of the next generation EU package, which is the de facto creation of European safe assets through Commission bond issuance. And many people have argued that will have a significant impact on European financial markets, at least in the short and medium term, and may serve as a precedent. But I have a deeper question about the failing forward framework and also the way that you and David apply it. And I wonder whether we should distinguish between failing forward and succeeding forward in the following sense, that as a number of the questions posed in the chat indicate, it's arguably not realistic to expect the EU to come forward with complete solutions to problems like the structure and governance of the Eurozone. So incremental, incomplete solutions are the most plausible ones. And then we can perhaps distinguish between elements which become ingredients or building blocks for future further reforms because they are successful, as opposed to things that really don't work and are discredited. I mean, we might think that in the case of banking union, the single supervisory mechanism would be a component of succeeding forward. And, in the discussion about next generation EU, indeed, there's a lot of discussion about what will happen with the national recovery and resilience plans and whether they will be seen or coded discursively as successes. And that plus, other elements like these European safe assets may play a major role in the next round of reform. So failing forward or succeeding forward.
Lucia, if you'd be okay, I would like maybe take two more questions, which are like directly going into the same direction as Jonathan's question is, because you already referred to that. And maybe Sandra and also Vivian would like to take up a word here and just add to what Jonathan was saying.
Great, yes. Very sensible.
Yeah, thank you. I will start with a spoiler alert. So the argument you make about too little, too late is certainly something we will pick up tomorrow in the debate with Vivian and Jan on the EU crisis. So, but my question was also about the failing forward approach. And as I read your paper and the approach, it's sort of a sequence of first neo-functionalists theorizing the spillover pressures, and then you have the intergovernmentalist dynamics. And I was just wondering how you yourself, how helpful you find this combination, and is there maybe a tendency to then underrate supranational dynamics at a later stage? I was attending a conference recently when Smith and others prepared presented work on the RRF, Resilience and Recovery Fund, and they basically argued that it was very much the Commission here in the driving seat rather than Germany and France. They would come in much later, and they made sort of drew on process tracing work showing that. So it's a bit about these integration theories and the supranational and intergovernmentalist dynamics. Thank you.
Vivian, please.
Yeah, so Lucia, I really liked this, but I'm going to push back a bit also on the failing forward, in that it seems to me that it works for the Eurozone crisis and previous crises, but as Jonathan mentioned, this looks much more like succeeding forward. I wonder if you couldn't say something about the importance of the change. I think you're looking more on the amount of money, which of course is appropriate, and it's certainly not enough. On the other hand, what about if affects the kind of perceptions by business? That is, doesn't it change the climate, the investment climate, because people are saying, oh, now, this is important. So you increase business confidence. So the private sector may invest more. And on top of that, think about the way in which, yes, it's a little bit of money, but where it's going. Green transition, digital transformation. And it seems to me that in a way, rather than saying, let's look at the package and it's not done enough, I would think of this as a new beginning. There's a leap forward, a succeeding forward, if you will, not enough, but it's a beginning that could be built on, that it may not. We still don't know if the escape clause will come back in, if the kinds of stupid rules that were there before will continue to be there, or, and I think this is quite clear, there are going to be some changes. And so the big question is, this is not a Hamiltonian moment, you're absolutely right, but is there a possibility that if this little bit of money works to help promote some kind of growth, and that Italy in particular does it right, that will then end up in a place where they'll become a permanent fund. So I'm asking you to really look toward the future. Sorry, and sorry for the...
No worries. I think now I have to take Amy as well, because her question was, I think, very much in the same direction.
Yes, thank you. And I somehow have lost the raise hand option, so apologies for that. Yeah, I think my question complements very much both previous questions. And mine comes from the angle of what you could reasonably expect. So during the financial crisis, we have, all these things that we just talked about. And then from sort of 2016 to 2020, we're in relatively good waters. But at that same time, we get Brexit and Trump, and all of the EU has to focus its attention on how to deal with this member state leaving. And it just doesn't seem to be the time to then start thinking about treaty change. And any major EMU redesign requires treaty change. So within those limits, there's only a very small window of what you can do. If you overshoot and come up with a really bold idea, you would then end up having ratification problems, even what would be in the treaty and so on. So the question I had for Lucia was, what is a reasonable expectation? So when do we see something that looks like we actually managed to do quite a lot, or not so much? And I would argue that the visionary sort of ideational, paradigmatic, institutional change that one could think about just did not have the circumstances available for it. So we, as scholars, knowing that all our theories provide us with insights as to what is the scope of what is possible, I would think there's very few people who would think that under these circumstances, one could think of treaty change. So then that should be the parameter. What could you just imagine is reasonable? And then how far did this reach the potential of what could be done? So thank you very much.
Okay, Lucia, I think you've got some big questions on your on your plate. You can try the best.
I need to read my handwriting. Yes, it's not big. Good. So thank you very much for the questions. Maybe I will start with Sandra's questions because the other one go in a sort of in a similar direction or pick up on similar points. So do we underplay the role of supranational actors? Yes, it is true. There is also, in a way, a practical explanation for this, in the sense that when we drafted the paper and also when we sent it out for review, it was still the sort of the early stage, or there was the intergovernmental stage of the negotiation. So even if we wanted, we couldn't include the second phase, which means from September onward, when it's true that the European Parliament in particular played an important role, and also to be fair, before that, also the European Commission in defining the contours of the of the Next Generation EU proposal. So in a sense, yes, we are aware of this. So we are saying it also partly depends on the time span we are looking at, which is from the beginning of the pandemic, or at least the outbreak of the pandemic in Europe, February, until was the September 2020. And I must say also I'm working with an Italian co-author on, again, a paper on the Next Generation EU. We are writing that in Italian because also we want to feed it to the Italian audience and also to the Italian media, because there is a lot of misrepresentation and poor understanding of what the Next Generation EU is. So in that paper, for example, partly because Edoardo Bressanelli is an expert on the European Parliament, we also have a section on the European Parliament and also the European Commission. Now, Jonathan's question, the creation of European safe assets is true. I can also link this point to Vivienne's comment about positive perception by business, and somebody else also pointed out in a different talk the potential multiplier effect. So we don't deny those, if you want, potential and assess potential economic effects. But our point was that these positive sides of the Next Generation EU, they don't really deal with the asymmetric configuration of EMU and the existing economic divergence in the euro area. So they help, they're important, maybe they should be stressed more in our paper, but they don't change that is our argument about underlying causes of divergence in EMU and how to deal with this. The failing forward or succeeding forward, we also had this debate or similar one when we had a workshop for the special issue, and in a sense, I'm not here to defend this approach, and in a sense, I'm sure that Eric and Daniel and Sophie will do a much better job. I think the kind of answer they will give in general, and then I will apply that to our case study, which is the Next Generation EU, is that there is a difference between compromise solutions, which are a little bit incomplete, but that they might succeed, and solution whereby policymakers, they are fully aware when they adopt those measures that this will not solve the problem and would lie further problem down the line, and they still do it. So it's something different from simply an incomplete solution or a compromise solution. It means that policymakers are aware that what they agree upon will not really solve the problem and would make it, will generate negative spillovers that will bring about another crisis. Now, with reference to our specific arguments on the Next Generation EU, and also the interesting comparison Jonathan made between banking union and the Next Generation EU, it is true that they are different, and in particular that the failing forward approach it works better or produce more clear-cut results in the case of banking union, whereas the Next Generation EU is somewhat bolder than that. Though I should also say, as somebody very fond of banking union, that also banking union, it was a major step. The single supervisory mechanism was surely something very important. It works quite well, but the single resolution mechanism and the resolution of banks in the European Union, it doesn't seem to work that well. There is to date no agreement on the European Deposit Insurance Scheme, which was also the third component. So to me, that was a better, if you want, example of a failing forward, because really out of the three pillars of EMU. One was set up and runs really well. The other one is half-baked, a single resolution mechanism. The other one is completely missing. And also for a long time, the fourth pillar, the backstop to the single resolution mechanism was also missing until when ESM took over this role. So also this brings me to also Vivienne's question or comment and Amy's comments. I start with Vivienne. It's true, we do look mostly at the amount of money, and maybe we should recognize more that in terms of political achievement, also diplomatic achievement, the next generation is remarkable. And it's also true that it might lead to permanent changes or lay the foundation for a major reform of EMU, but we don't know it at this stage. So that's why David and I, we were still inclined to see this not as a major success, but as maybe not really a fully fledged failure. That would be unfair, but I think that explains our cautious attitude to the ability of the next generation EU to solve the chronic problems of the economic and monetary union. The final point, Amy, it's a good point about treaty change. I'm not an expert of the legal provisions, but I guess that even without, I'm thinking hypothetically here, even without resorting to a treaty change, even a large amount of grants, as was, for example, initially proposed by the Franco-German proposal, would have made a difference, and that would not have required a treaty change. So we also know that European Union policymakers can be quite creative when it's time to come up with solutions, and there is the political will to do that. So I don't know whether I did justice to all the comments or questions. I should also add that David, he's a real gentleman. So when I told him that I would be presenting this, I asked his permission, and then he also told me, well, if you get some very critical comments or very difficult questions, you can blame me. Or you can defer the question to me or deflect them to me. So of course it's not what I am doing, but yes, in a sense, that's sort of, I've said it.
Very good. Everyone's informed now. You can drop email bombs at David. Thank you, Lucia, for that round. We try to have a final round of comments. I would ask everyone to be as brief as possible. So we can have all the comments which are outstanding. Diane, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Daniel and Lucia, for a very interesting presentation. I must confess I was not aware of this failing forward concept. So my comments are more related to the paper and the argument you're making in general. And I just wonder, so maybe one side comment before I turn to the larger comment. I wonder, for instance, when you say at the end that this is not so novel, if the ESM, for instance, is the right point of comparison, because I do see, significant differences, be it because it's outside of the treaty framework, intergovernmental, et cetera, et cetera. So that was just a side note. But then in terms of your main argument, which, as I understand it, is the fact that it doesn't solve the problem and the divergences, et cetera. And I wonder, first of all, if that was ever the goal. And second of all, was it for the EU and not for the member states? I think, but perhaps that's just for the presentation, but, the expectations on the European Union shouldn't be too high. The EU is there to complement what the member states are doing. It's not there to solve the problem of 160% of GDP debt in Italy, to put it bluntly, in my view at least. And this is also combined with the limited legal framework, which, like Amy was saying, is really putting a very important constraint on the EU. And I would defend the fact that the EU on this occasion has been extremely creative with the sealing of the own resources decision, etc. And in this regard, I'm not sure I would share the hypothesis you were making at the end that we could have had more grants. First and foremost, because that is then linked with the additional own resources for the European Union in the future. So in a way, if you increase the amount that the member states don't have to repay, you need also accordingly to increase the amount that the EU is going to gain. And maybe last point, if I may. Yes, last point. I just wonder if perhaps on the one hand, you don't take Next Generation EU too much in isolation from all the measures that have been adopted. And the second point is, shouldn't we see an important step forward in the departure from the EU area thinking that was predominant until then to the EU 27 that is offered by the solutions we have adopted? Thank you very much, and sorry for being so long.
Okay, Matthias, please, even quicker.
Thanks a lot. Wonderful paper. I wonder, thinking about this Hamiltonian moments, if we're not stuck in a Enlightenment thinking that really, thinks that society is constructed from one big event, from a revolutionary atmosphere. Luc van Middelaar has provided this wonderful analysis of EU reform, and he thinks that, the base model for us should really be incrementalism. And if we base our idea about the financial state or a state of EMU on such an incrementalism, then I'm not so sure whether we're really failing forward or rather succeeding forward. Because if you look at the funds that EU has in all the programs that you mentioned, very often, this is money that I would say creative money that you can use for creative uses, research and development, regional investment programs, climate change, industrial policies, etc. The European Investment Bank, I think we should not forget about that. And that really makes the EU a very important actor in terms of the development or, the creative function of the state and the impulses that fiscal policy can give. So fiscal policy is uninteresting if you just use it to pay policemen or teachers. Well, maybe teachers is already a bit interesting, but I think the EU has a lot of creative potential, and if it manages to get its own taxes, I think then at least I would say that one could probably argue that we're in a new situation, even if it's not one moment.
Okay, I believe we would have many more questions. I know there are some also comments, for example, by Paul in the chat, and the Q&A has an interesting comment as well. I'd just like to reiterate Andreas' comments because, Lucia, it kind of resonates with what has been said. As you can see, Andreas has been asking what would be the alternative when we're now talking about tax or something else. He asking also if German rebalancing wouldn't be kind of the core instrument to be following through if one wants to address the asymmetries. So this is the last plate of question for you, and you would have the last words to kind of tackle some of these questions.
Thank you. I should also apologize. I wasn't able to think and follow the chat at the same time. I'm not very good at multitasking, so I was fully concentrating, trying to understand the questions and come up with at least a reasonable, sensible answer. I'm not sure I succeeded on the second task, but at least I understood the questions. So quickly, Diane's comment. I will pick up one that indeed was something that David and I have been discussing amongst ourselves, back and forth, whether we were expecting too much from the European Union. In particular, we were expecting the European Union to solve the problems of the member states that they have because of their own, for example, dysfunctional political or economic systems, and no specific reference to countries. So in a sense, that is true. And, the COVID pandemic was a major shock, but we're also saying that the solutions that were adopted they sort of provide the worst, but they didn't. So we were not expecting, we were not hoping to come up with the solutions to the political economic problems of different member states, but at least to come up with solutions that will have a more asymmetric policy framework for EMU, and would also substantially help to address the asymmetries in EMU, which at least are in part generated by the institutional and policy framework. Some of them have to do with the performance of the member states and their political economic system, but some of them actually have to do also with the functioning of the single currency. And the next generation EU doesn't really deal with this issue. Then Matthias' comment, and also I think was also Andrea's comment about incrementalism. I think incrementalism works, but then when dealing with a major crisis, I'm not sure that incrementalism really cuts it. So I think we are reaching 5 o'clock. I'm sorry, I'm just thinking whether I overlooked some question. Was maybe sort of.
Maybe the last point, if you would go for the alternative about what do you think about German rebalancing? Yeah, it's that, for example, would be a kind of alternative solution. Okay, Andreas is happy. I think indeed we have reached 5 o'clock, but still there are a number of comments in the chat. Maybe you want to have a look. We still have that open and maybe respond directly via the chat if that's still possible. Of course, because you are also so generous to offer comments to the next panel. So it's only fair to give you a break and give everyone else a break. In the next 15 minutes before we reconvene at 5:15. I want to thank everyone, Lucia, in particular you, for presenting your work, discussing with everyone else on the panel, for raising the questions and comments, and looking forward to the next panel.